to my kitchen. Today is 1944 kitchen. What was it like for the housewife of 1944? I've transformed my kitchen into an old-fashioned kitchen, and that's how it's going to be for this year. I'm going to share with you all kinds of recipes, all kinds of ideas from the 1940s to the 1970s. It's going to be really exciting. But today we focus on 1944. I'm going to do some canning today, and I'm going to show you and share with you all kinds of stories about the 1940s kitchen. And I'm going to be following the recipe in the Home Candy Guide to 1944. I'm really working on having vintage items and sharing with you what it was like. So in 1940s, the kitchen was the hub of activity. The kitchen was where most people met. They sat at the kitchen table, they ate, they talked. They spent a lot of their time in the kitchen. Before 1940, the kitchen was the warmest part of the house. And so a lot of people would spend most of their time in the kitchen because that's where it was always warm and there was always food being cooked on the stove. In the 1940s, then electricity came, and so the modern woman became very different. But still, in the 1944, in the Depression era, things were really tight. People didn't have money, and they did everything to save money. Today, we're going to be canning, and I'm going to show you canning jars. So the one thing that is remarkable about having canning jars is because through the years, if you store them properly, they will last you. I'm really fascinated about canning jars, and I'm fascinated about all the different years. And so these were from my grandma Fanny, and these were from the 1940s up into the 1960s. So we have the Atlas jars. Then of course we have the modern ball jars that we have today. But we have all different kinds of jars. This is a Kerr jar, which Ball actually owns now, but this is a Kerr jar, and this is estimated about 1950. And these jars are just as good as the new ones you buy today if they're not cracked, and you can use them the same way. So in the Depression era, people didn't waste anything, and they also didn't get rid of anything. And so they saved everything. And when a grandma would die, all of her wonderful things like this would be passed down to her children and then to her grandchildren. Nowadays, when somebody dies and they have things like this, the general population, they don't want it. And that is really sad because books like these and canning jars like this and oil lanterns and all these beautiful things, the 12 steps to canning, this was from 1930s, all of these things are slowly going away. And estate sales are no longer the in thing anymore like they used to be. And we need to bring it back to life. And that's where I'm here. So in these little cookbooks, or you want to call canning books, it's so quaint. They have the beautiful illustrations that are so retro in today's society. And it's so neat. But I'm going to share with you what I'm working on today in the kitchen. Because I'm going to implement my everyday life. And I'm just going to give it a little bit of a twist. I'm going to share with you my kitchen behind me because I'm fascinated by the old things and I really want to use everything that was original and vintage. I know some things I can't do. So we are going to pressure can these tomatoes. Back in the 1940s, there were pressure canners, but with today's standards and USDA, I won't be canning with the old canners of the 1940s. But it's all relatively the same. Today I'm going to be pressure canning my tomatoes simply because I'm going to be adding a lot of ingredients to it. But in the 1940s, they water bathed it in so many different ways to be combined with so many other foods that the variety they provide is almost unlimited. Nutrition authorities too advise filling your shelves with rows and rows of canned tomatoes. They supply some vitamin A, and they are a good source of vitamin C, which we all need daily because our bodies store a little of it. That's why it's so essential to have plenty of tomatoes on hand when citrus food is hard to buy and fresh berries or raw salad greens are out of season. Remember, it requires almost twice as much tomato juice to give you that vitamin C provided in orange juice. So make your canning plans accordingly. And here is a screenshot of different things they are saying about tomatoes in 1944. Process all your tomato products in a boiling water bath. Drain your tomatoes on stakes. Soil harbors bacteria, which can cause spoilage. And sometimes when tomatoes rest on the ground, spoilage may get a head start. Always wash your tomatoes thoroughly in cold water before you scald them. A lump of soil may contain bacteria, which will contaminate the whole batch in the peeling process. Never try to salvage the firm part of the tomato that is partially spoiled or blighted. It's thrifty to salvage it for immediate use rather than lose the whole jar, or perhaps a whole batch. 1944, it was all about saving money and all about salvaging everything you could. And that is where 1940s, and that's where the Depression era comes in. And you know what? That's why it can help you today, because we're back into a situation where people don't have extra money. We're back into a situation where people are going to have to learn to do without. They're going to have to salvage everything they have. It looks like we're headed this way for quite a long time. And I believe that the Depression era can come back to life. So we're going to go ahead and I'm going to work on my tomatoes. Today I'm making pizza sauce. Back in the 1940s, they would have made stewed tomatoes. Stewed tomatoes is basically just tomatoes and some juice, and they add a little bit of brown sugar. But I'm going to make pizza sauce because we are living in 2021. And so even though that we are living in the modern day and we use modern foods, we can always implement a little bit of the old ways in our work and in our time. I got tomatoes out of the freezer, and we're making spaghetti sauce. I added some tomato paste, and then I'm going to go ahead and add some ingredients as well to it. 1944, they would have used potato mashers, and that's how I'm going to mash up all of these tomatoes. So what I have in here is whole tomatoes and some tomato sauce and a little bit of tomato paste. Now, and I have peppers and I have onions. So I'm going to go ahead and we're just going to cook these down a little bit. I may also add a little bit of tomato juice just to make it a little bit thinner. It's just a slight bit too thick. So I have 2 large kettles here, and we'll add some spices, and then we'll can it up. Waste not, want not. That is something that holds true today, not just in the 1940s. All right, so I'll get back to you in just a little bit when this is getting closer to being ready to jar it up. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to add my spice mix. Now this is my seasoning mix, and I have a video on it. It is oregano and garlic and basil. I grow this on my own garden, and I dehydrate it, and it is actually amazing. So I'm actually using quite a bit because there's a lot of sauce in here. All we have to do now is get it really good and hot, and then I can jar it up. Now I did add a little bit of some pepper here. I have to taste it, and then I will add some salt. I try to go lighter on the seasonings because after you can food, it can change a little bit of some of your spices and seasonings that you use. And I want to go light on the salt because I'd rather have less salt and add some at the table than have too much of it. So I'm really finicky about using a lot of salt. But that's just my preference. All right, we're gonna get this good and hot, and then I'll give it a taste and see what it needs yet. Take a look at that beautiful sauce. You can use it for spaghetti or pizza. It's the perfect consistency that I like. It's not too thick, but yet it's not too runny. All right, I'm gonna add a little bit of salt to it. I use smoked salt. I hardly ever use iodized salt for anything. So we're going to add a little salt to it, and then I'll meet you over at the counter and we'll jar it up. So back in the 1940s, women would get together and they would can together. There was multiple generations that would get together and even live together and help each other out. In those days, when a woman got married, a lot of the times the gifts were just practical items that you need as far as to live and can and preserve your own food. A lot of women to this day love gifts like that, but some people, I think, would scoff at the idea of having canning jars as a wedding gift. One silver lining about all this that's happened in our world is this. I think a lot of people are taking notice about the old ways of living. I think a lot of people are taking stock of what really matters in life. And if you can say that's a silver lining, that's one silver lining that we can think about. And bringing back old traditions to life. I know a lot of you don't can anymore, but I think you're going to enjoy watching me and just stepping back into time just a little bit. So in the 1940s and 50s, they would have pots that were aluminum. I don't cook with aluminum anymore. It's something that I prefer not to do. Also, tomatoes can react to aluminum, so I really don't use that. There are certain things back in the 50s and the 40s that you probably wouldn't want to do nowadays, but you can always implement everything into your life. Now, a lot of you do still cook with aluminum, so it's just your preference. Back in the 80s, there was a study that they claimed by cooking in aluminum can cause a greater chance of Alzheimer's. So that's one of the reasons why I don't cook with aluminum, but in other countries, people do. So it's everyone's preference. Everyone's home is different. All right, I'm going to continue jarring this up, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the Depression era and how we can implement that in our life. So that gave us 14 quarts plus another 2 quarts for a meal tonight. I'm going to be making some spaghetti. So what other things would I not implement that they did in the 1940s? Well, a lot of the times, my grandma, she would reuse lids. Now, I do reuse lids for dried food, and I will use it for jellies sometimes, but I really don't reuse my lids. I know some people do, but for me, I think it's so much work going into canning all of this food. I wouldn't want to have my seals fail. And practices like that is something that I'm always really good about. I am what you would call a little bit of a rebel canner. Now, back in the 1940s, people canned like that. But, like I canned butter and things like that. But I do take some serious safety precautions and always use new lids. Working with low acid foods. A lot of people like to know all about canning. Well, they want to start. It's really simple with YouTube and all the videos you have right now. And a good book is the Ball Book of Canning. It's really simple. I would start with high acid foods and do boiling water bath. That's easy to start with. High acid foods are tomatoes and your fruits, pickles, all of those type things, jellies and jams. Those are so easy to can. All right, I wiped off all of my rims, and so now I'm gonna go ahead and put the lid on, and we're gonna pressure can this for about 30 minutes. You probably wouldn't need to pressure can this. I did add some peppers and onions to it. If you would add a teaspoon of lemon juice per jar, but for me, it's just as easy to pressure can because then I don't have to have all of that water, and it's so much easier for me. So I'm just gonna go ahead and pressure can it. So what is your fondest memories of the Great Depression, stories about your mother or your grandma shared with you? I know some of you who watch my videos lived through the Great Depression, while most of us heard stories. My family, we really weren't affected by the Great Depression because all of my relatives were farming community, so they lived on the farm. And really things didn't hurt them quite as much financially because they were self-sufficient. But there were times when clothing and shoes, especially shoes, were scarce. And so rubber and all of those items, they were saved for the war front. And so they didn't have the things that they were used to having. So everyone, in one degree or another, was impacted by the Great Depression. Things like sugar and flour, all those things skyrocketed, and they could only have a certain amount of it. Certain things like that, like sugar, they didn't grow. But then they had honey, and so they would supplement honey on things that they could produce on the farm. I think the biggest thing I learned about the Great Depression is how people learn to adapt. And learning to adapt is something that I'm really good at doing. I'm learning very, very easily how you can adapt to different things in your life. And I think that's the key to success, is learning to adapt and being thankful. So learning to adapt is something that I think all of us are learning these days. I mean, think about it. But if we can do it in a way that is of a pleasant attitude, it makes your life so much easier. Yes, I know there are things happening in the world that we don't necessarily approve of, but griping and being upset and complaining, it's just really going to cause a lot of stress in your life. And you know what? I don't know about you, but for me, life is short. All right, everyone, I'm going to go ahead and pop these into the pressure canner, and I'll see you in just a little bit.